All right, well, last week we kicked off a series on relationships called It's Complicated. We're looking at the Old Testament book of Ruth for help with our relationships. And can we just admit up front, relationships are complicated. Like, relationships are just complicated, and that's why we called this series It's Complicated. I'm not just talking about marriage. I'm not just talking about dating. I'm talking about all relationships. And so what I want to do is I want to find some universal principles that are going to help us have better relationships from this book of Ruth. Better friendships, better marriages, healthier dating relationships, even could help out with parent and child relationships. That's our goal. So last week we discovered a Hebrew word in Ruth chapter 1, and it sums up this idea of healthy relationships really well, and it's the word hesed. Hesed is translated love or kindness, and hesed is the way that God loves. It's that kind of love. It's sacrificial. It's a committed love. It's love without an exit strategy. All right, so that word shows up here in the book of Ruth. And it might go without saying, but all marriages should be defined by hesed love. All marriages should have that. But hesed love isn't just confined to marriage. Hesed love can exist also in friendships, and we see it in this amazing friendship in the book of Ruth. The backstory is this. Because of a famine, Naomi and her family, which is her husband and her two sons, they moved from Bethlehem in Israel. They moved to a nation called Moab. And once they live in Moab, her sons actually marry women from Moab, Moabite women. And then her husband, Elimelech, and her two sons, they die. And they leave the three women alone. And in that culture, with no husband and no sons, Naomi is completely destitute. Her life is basically over. And she says, okay, I'm going to go back to Bethlehem and see if maybe I can pick up the pieces. And she encourages her daughters-in-law to go back to their families in Moab, and they're going to part ways. Well, one daughter-in-law does end up returning home, but Ruth refuses to leave Naomi. And we see in Ruth chapter 1 that Ruth commits herself to Naomi, who's her mother-in-law, and she says, I'm going to go with you, and I'm not going to abandon you. All right, that's hesed love that we see right off the bat in this. And we see that Ruth, there's this cool progression. Ruth is committed to God first and foremost. Then she commits herself to Naomi, and then her hesed love points Naomi back to God, which is really cool. And there's a glimmer of hope at the end of Ruth chapter 1 as these two women are returning, and this is what it says. It says, so Naomi returned from Moab, accompanied by Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, and arriving in Bethlehem as the barley harvest was beginning. All right, now, this story was originally written in Hebrew. It was originally written over 3,000 years ago, so we have to acknowledge there's some stuff lost in translation. There's some cultural differences between then and now, right? And for example, in the original Hebrew of this verse, the author is actually emphasizing the time that they returned to Bethlehem, that it was during the barley harvest. So to try to express that, it just so happened, right, that there was a barley harvest when they showed up. And an ancient reader would understand that this is what the author's trying to do. The author's kind of giving us a little wink and a nudge saying, hey, it just so happened that it was the barley harvest, right? As in, watch how God's going to work behind the scenes for these two women to take care of them, and to just watch how God shows hesed love, his committed love to these women. And this becomes a theme in the book of Ruth. Now, it's not our main point for today, but it is kind of fun to watch this unfold in the book of Ruth. Look for all the coincidences that happen in the story that aren't actually coincidences, that are really God working behind the scenes. And it's something called God's providence. It's called God's providence. And you can think about it this way. Imagine that God has two hands. One hand is the visible hand of God's miracles. And you see this all over the Bible where, God parts the sea, God makes the sun stand still, God raises people from the dead, and he intervenes, and it's this visible hand of miracles. But then God also has this invisible hand of God's providence. God works behind the scenes. People meet each other at just the right time. As events unfold, people happen to end up in the right place. God provides. Right in the middle of everyday life, God is working. So there's both of these things. Many of the books of the Bible, we're familiar with those actions that God takes where he works in power to save his people. You can see that all over the Bible. What we sometimes miss, and the book of Ruth is all about this, is the way that God is working in the everyday that we don't see, that we don't always acknowledge. And so we see his invisible hand of providence at work in the book of Ruth. And this is a story about trusting God in the everyday. and showing up, and God showing up in quiet but significant ways. All right? So let's jump into Ruth chapter 2 and just watch how God works in this. It says, now Naomi had a relative on her husband's side, a man of standing from the clan of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. Why is the author telling us this? Just watch, right? And Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, let me go to the fields and pick up the leftover grain behind anyone in whose eyes I find favor. Naomi said to her, go ahead, my daughter. So she went out, entered a field, and began to glean behind the harvesters. As it turned out, she was working in a field belonging to Boaz, who was from the clan of Elimelech. All right? So Ruth just happens to be in this field of this guy named Boaz. What do we call that? Is that a coincidence or is that providence, right? We know this is not a coincidence. And Boaz is from the same clan of Elimelech, who is Naomi's dead husband. That's important, right? God's unseen hand of providence is guiding Ruth. Ruth is gleaning behind the harvesters. And this idea of gleaning is this ancient practice that was basically an ancient form of social services where God had actually commanded his people, as you gather up your grain, and they would do it by hand, they would cut the grain, they would gather it up. If you happen to drop some grain on the ground, don't pick it up. Leave it there, and then people who are poor can come through. They can pick up what was dropped. So the poor can get food, and they're actually working for their food, and it's something that God built into it. So it's tedious, right? It's back-killing work because you're bending over all day picking up grain, but Ruth is willing to do this because she cares for Naomi, and she's committed, and she's motivated by love for Naomi. So just look what comes next. Verse 4. It says, just then, Boaz arrived from Bethlehem and greeted the harvesters. The Lord be with you. The Lord bless you, they answered. And wouldn't you know it, Boaz shows up, right? Coincidence or providence? I'm just saying. All right, Boaz shows up, and what do you think is the first thing he notices? Look at verse 5. Boaz asked the overseer of his harvesters, who does that young woman belong to? The overseer replied, she is the Moabite who came back from Moab with Naomi. She said, please let me glean and gather among the sheaves from behind the harvesters. She came into the field and has remained here from morning till now, except for a short rest in the shelter. All right, so a couple things. First of all, you might have noticed that Boaz asked, it might seem like a strange question, he asked, who does she belong to? Instead of who is that woman? It's kind of an interesting question. Well, this represents a difference between our culture and that culture of the ancient Near East that we're talking about. And actually, there's kind of a difference even today between what we're used to and what you would experience in a non-Western culture like in Asia or Africa. You might see something more like this, where we tend to define ourselves as individuals, and when we tend to see people in terms of their individual identity. But in non-Western cultures, they tend to see people in terms of their community. So what community do they belong to? What village? Which clan, right? Which family? So we ask, who is that person? They would ask, whom does that person belong to? And so that's a very valid question for Boaz to ask. The first thing he notices is that Ruth doesn't have any peeps, right? She doesn't have any people with her. So all the other people gleaning would be part of groups, especially the women. In that culture, women are in groups or they're with their husband. That's how it goes. They're not by themselves. A lone woman working would have stuck out like a sore thumb. And that's why it's the first thing he notices. So we learn something about Boaz when he asks this question. We learn that he's a safe person. We're going to be talking about safe people today. And we know he's a safe person because he cares about the people that are gleaning in his field. He doesn't have to, but he does, right? So here's the sad reality. It was extremely unsafe for a woman to be on her own in that time and place. So Ruth is placing herself in great danger by going and gleaning on her own. In the book of Ruth, it takes place in the time of the judges. We find out in the first chapter. And so if you want to see how dangerous it could be for a woman during those times, later on you can go read Judges chapter 19. I'm warning you, it's a horrific story. It's not a fun story to read, but it does tell you just how dangerous it was for women during that time. But Ruth didn't have much of a choice, did she? She has to take care of herself. She has to take care of Naomi. Ruth is amazing. And she's aware of all these cultural realities, that she's aware that she's placing herself in danger by going out there by herself. She's risking her reputation and her safety, but she's doing it for Naomi. Boaz wants all the people in his field to be safe, and he wants them to be taken care of because he's a safe person. And we'll talk more about what it means to be a safe person here in a minute, so file that one away. But Boaz's overseer tells him, hey, that's Ruth. She's the Moabite woman that came back with Naomi. And actually, Boaz, we're going to find out, is familiar with Ruth's story. And so he's putting two and two together here. And so he comes up to her in verse 8. This is what he says. It says, so Boaz said to Ruth, my daughter, listen to me. Don't go and glean in another field, and don't go away from here. Stay here with the women who work for me. Watch the field where the men are harvesting, and follow along after the women. I have told the men not to lay a hand on you. And whenever you are thirsty, go and get a drink from the water jars the men have filled. And we might read this and think, oh, that's cool. Boaz is a nice guy. Like he's generous, he's helpful. But what's really going on here is mind-blowing, actually. Like if anybody had overheard this conversation, they would have just been astounded. Because for one thing, in that culture, even him talking to her is a big deal. The fact that he calls her daughter is huge. In that culture, your gender really mattered, your social standing really mattered, your connections really mattered, your nationality really mattered as far as your social standing would go. And author Paul E. Miller says this. He says, multiple barriers separate Ruth, a disconnected, poor female Moabite foreigner, from Boaz, a connected, wealthy male Israelite clan leader. He breaks through all those barriers with one word, daughter. So Ruth doesn't have any peeps, right? She doesn't have any people. Boaz is basically saying, you can join up with my people. He says, I told the men not to mess with you. And it's actually really sad that he even has to do that. But that's what he does. And it's because, if she's this unconnected woman, then there's a high likelihood that somebody could do whatever they wanted and there would be no consequences. So he makes sure that she's taken care of. And then he tells her, you can drink from my water jars. And once again, we think, okay, no big deal. She can get a drink if she wants to. But think about it. Drinking vessels are a big deal when it comes to cross-cultural tension or cross-racial tension. It wasn't that long ago in this nation, in certain places, black people and white people couldn't drink from the same drinking fountain. It's a big deal, all right? And so Boaz is saying to Ruth in every possible way, you are one of us. He's inviting her into community. And of course, Ruth is absolutely blown away by this, right? So if you look at verse 10, it says, at this, Ruth bowed down with her face to the ground. She asked him, why have I found such favor in your eyes that you notice me, a foreigner? Now listen to this. Boaz replied, I've been told all about what you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband, how you left your father and mother in your homeland and came to live with a people you did not know before. May the Lord repay you for what you have done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. May I continue to find favor in your eyes, my Lord, she said. You have put me at ease by speaking kindly to your servant, though I do not have the standing of one of your servants. Ruth says, why would you notice me? I'm a nobody. And Boaz has this amazing answer. How could I not notice this amazing love that you showed your mother-in-law? How could I not see how you've been committed to her? Ruth is in awe of Boaz's kindness, but Boaz is in awe of Ruth's love. And this is an amazing moment because it shows just how powerful Hesed love can be. It causes this well-to-do man to stop dead in his tracks. And we see him thinking, like, okay, so this is the woman that I've been hearing so much about, that came back with Naomi. And we get the feeling that he's like just met this rock star of Hesed love. Like, can I have your autograph, Ruth? Like, that's kind of the attitude he has. Now Boaz stands up and he gives her this one-man standing ovation. It's an incredible moment. And we should be impressed with Ruth the same way that Boaz is impressed with Ruth, because not because she's powerful in the world's eyes, because in the world's eyes she's a nobody. That's not why we should be impressed. We should be impressed because she has no faith in her own abilities or her own social standing. She can't. She doesn't have that. So her faith is completely in God. She entrusts herself completely to God. And that's the first step for us as well when it comes to having better relationships, is to entrust yourself first to God. Regardless of your story, of your background, of your failures, your successes, your social standing, how much money you have, your connections, whatever it is, entrust yourself to God. That's the first thing. And this is the part where I encourage you too. If you've never placed your trust in Jesus for the first time, if you've never made that decision, today is the day to do that, because you can't trust in any of these other things. You can only trust in God. So if you have any questions about what it means to follow Jesus, what it means to place your trust in Him, I'd love to talk with you about that. I know Mario or DJ would also love to talk with you as well. God doesn't need the so-called important people. And so God decides to work through this Moabite woman to teach Naomi, to teach Boaz, and to teach us just what the love of God is like. Think about that. And it goes further than that, because even today, the contributions of women in the world are often overlooked because they don't have the social standing. They don't have the same social standing as men in a lot of cases. Author Carolyn Custis James says this: the book of Ruth turns the spotlight on the plight of women in the world for the whole church to learn. All over the world, there's these amazing women. They don't have the social standing, they don't have the resources, and yet they are still elevating their families and elevating their communities out of poverty by the things that they're doing. The question is, do we see it? Do we notice it? Sometimes we need a new set of eyes in order to see our blind spots. So my suggestion is maybe we need to learn to see the women of the world through the eyes of Boaz. Notice in verse 12 that Boaz prays a blessing over Ruth, and he says, for what you've done, may the Lord repay you. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel. And blessings are a big deal in the book of Ruth. Actually, I've asked you to be on the watch for these coincidences. Also, if you're reading the book of Ruth, look for the blessings. I just did a quick reading, and I counted 10 different times when somebody blesses another person in the book of Ruth. So blessings are a big deal. That's a lot for a short book, right? And so try to read it and find the times that happens. What's crazy is, first of all these blessings we see, they end up happening by the end of the book. The second thing is, in this case, Boaz blesses Ruth, right? And then he becomes the answer to his own prayer, which is pretty incredible. He prays that God would richly reward Ruth, and then we're going to see that Boaz goes above and beyond to help Ruth to make sure she's taken care of. So, both Ruth and Boaz point forward to Jesus in this book. Ruth points forward to Jesus in the sacrificial way that she loves Naomi. See that Jesus loves us sacrificially. Boaz points forward to Jesus in the way that he becomes a blessing to Ruth. They're both pointing forward to Jesus. This entire story is meant to point us to the goodness of God and the grace of God. That's the whole point. And we see the goodness of God put on display in the lives of Boaz, in the life of Ruth. We see the goodness of God put on display in Jesus. So there's a connection there. All right, look what happens next. Verse 14. At mealtime, Boaz said to her, "Come over here, have some bread and dip it in the wine vinegar." When she sat down with the harvesters, he offered her some roasted grain. She ate all she wanted and had some left over. As she got up to glean, Boaz gave orders to his men. "Let her gather among the sheaves and don't reprimand her. Even pull out some stalks for her from the bundles and leave them for her to pick up, and don't rebuke her." So Boaz invites her to the table to eat with him. Now, and his workers and stuff. So if you thought the drinking vessel thing was crazy, this is 10 times more crazy than that. All right? He's inviting her to the table. And I think this might be the only record in the Old Testament of a man serving a woman. It just didn't happen. Okay? It's extremely rare. And he makes sure that Ruth is going to have plenty more to glean from in the afternoon. So why is Boaz doing all of this? Well, as we've seen, he is amazed by Ruth's love of Naomi. It's inspiring to him. And because he's a safe person. And we're going to talk more about that in a minute. But look at verse 17. So Ruth gleaned in the field until evening. Then she threshed the barley she had gathered, and it amounted to about an ephah. She carried it back to town, and her mother-in-law saw how much she had gathered. Ruth also brought out and gave her what she had left over after she'd eaten enough. Her mother-in-law asked her, "Where did you glean today? Where did you work? Blessed be the man who took notice of you." All right, so an ephah of grain is about 30 pounds of grain. So that's a lot. If grain could be considered an ancient form of income, basically she just earned about a half month's income in one day. All right, so it's pretty crazy. You can understand why Naomi's mind is blown. So let's finish the story here. Verse 19. Ruth told her mother-in-law about the one whose place she had been working. The name of the man I worked with today is Boaz, she said. The Lord bless him, Naomi said to her daughter-in-law. He has not stopped showing his kindness to the living and the dead. She added, that man is our close relative, and he is one of our guardian redeemers. Then Ruth the Moabite said, he even said to me, stay with my workers until they finish harvesting all my grain. Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, it will be good for you, my daughter, to go with the women who work for him, because in someone else's field you might be harmed. So Ruth stayed close to the women of Boaz to glean until the barley and wheat harvests were finished, and she lived with her mother-in-law. All right, so Naomi calls Boaz a guardian redeemer. We'll talk more about what that means next week. But let me just sum up the story like this. Ruth gleaned in the right field that day. She gleaned in the right field that day. Because of the great love that Ruth showed Naomi, Boaz then was, she caught his attention. She caught the attention of the right person. This is all God working behind the scenes. This is his invisible hand of providence. Okay? So, this is a great story, but what does it have to do with our relationships? Well, there's a lot we can learn from how Ruth loves and honors Naomi, and a lot we can learn from how Boaz honors Ruth. And I just want to say a couple things about honor, because I don't think we can understand our main idea today without us grasping the idea of honor. Romans 12:10 says, love each other with genuine affection and take delight in honoring each other. And that's what we see in the story, that Ruth takes delight in honoring Naomi, and Boaz takes delight in honoring Ruth. Honor is this recognition of the importance or value in another person. That's what honor is. And a real community, Paul says, is defined by honoring one another. He says, loving one another with genuine affection means that we honor one another, okay? And I implied this earlier, but let me just come out and say it. A community that doesn't honor both women and men doesn't honor God. All right? We also get that from this passage. There's a lot more I could say about that statement, but I'm just going to let Boaz's actions speak louder than words today and leave it at that. But here's a very powerful evaluation question we can ask one another, and that is, do you feel honored by me? Do you feel honored by me? If you're afraid to ask that question in your friendships, if you're afraid to ask that question in your marriage, then that tells you something. We all have a lot to learn about honoring one another. We can learn it from this story, okay? And we see God's invisible hand of providence is at work in the story, so we need to trust God first and foremost. And like I said earlier, the first step when it comes to having better relationships is to entrust yourself to God first. We kind of talked about this last week, but better relationships with people comes from having a growing relationship with God. So the first step to better relationships is to entrust yourself to God first. If you're dating, entrust yourself to God first. If you're trying to work on your marriage, entrust yourself to God first. If you're trying to find a group of friends who will encourage you in your faith, entrust yourself to God first. But there's a second step to having better relationships, and we really need to get this. And that is entrust yourself to God first, and then entrust your heart to safe people. Entrust your heart to safe people. I mentioned multiple times today that Boaz shows himself to be a safe person. But what does that mean? Well, if you're one of those people that loves to take notes, you're welcome, because I'm going to give you a list of 9 attributes of safe people that we see from this story. We're going to go through these pretty quick, but I'll make sure we post it on our Facebook page as well in case you miss it and you want to go find it later. But let me give you a quick disclaimer before I list these off. Okay, I'm not saying that we don't ever have a relationship with somebody who's not a safe person. That's not what I'm saying. I am, because we're called to reach out in our faith. I hope we're talking to all sorts of people, interacting with all sorts of people. What I am saying is we need to be wise about who we entrust our hearts to. I'm talking about deep friendships. I'm talking about dating relationships. I'm talking about spouses. These people that we entrust our hearts to, they need to be safe people. We're going to be close to them. If we want our relationships to be healthy, we need to entrust our hearts to safe people. So that said, let's look at these attributes of safe people. First of all, safe people understand the father heart of God. We see that Boaz calls Ruth daughter, right? He's not saying that she's his daughter. He's acknowledging that she's the daughter of God. And so she has value. That's what he's saying. She needs to be honored. Men, so many women have been harmed in this world because men don't understand the father heart of God. Here's a question for you. How can we as men receive this heart from God so that the women around us, the women in our lives, are cared for, and that those are life-giving relationships, not where we're trying to take something? Whether it's a wife or a girlfriend, or maybe you're single, you have a girl you're interested in, you need to understand the father heart of God. A real test of a man's character is how he treats the women in his life, right? We know that. All right, safe people care about our safety. We see this in how Boaz creates a safe environment for Ruth. Are you entrusting yourself to people who care about your safety, both your emotional and your physical safety? Safe people introduce us to other safe people. Boaz says to Ruth, stay with these women who work with me. And so safe people are going to make sure that we are surrounded by other safe people. He understands that Ruth doesn't just need her physical needs met, that she needs a community around her. So he gives her a community, helps her find one. Safe people establish good boundaries. Boaz lets Ruth know that where she can expect to be safe. These are my fields. If you're out of my fields, you might be placing yourself in danger. Safe people show us the ropes when we're in an unfamiliar situation. Men, once again, if you are in a dating relationship with a girl, it's your job to be upfront about what are the healthy boundaries as far as purity. There's too many men who are always trying to push the boundaries instead of establish the boundaries. You know what I'm talking about. She should be able to know she's safe when she's with you. And ladies, it's totally acceptable for you to expect that from the guys you're dating. If he's not willing to establish those boundaries, then he doesn't care about your safety. All right? Safe people are generous. We definitely see this with Boaz and with Ruth. Both are very generous. Safe people encourage our character. I love how Boaz applauds Ruth's character. He recognizes something praiseworthy in her, and he doesn't let social barriers stop him from calling out what he sees. I love that. Safe people pray that we would flourish. Like we already talked about, Boaz prays for Ruth, and he becomes the answer to that prayer. He works to be that. Safe people provide comfort and kindness. And like I said earlier, Boaz prays that prayer. He acts to be the answer to that prayer. Ruth says, you've shown kindness to me. And then last, safe people point us to God as our safe place. Now, we see this when Boaz prays a blessing over Ruth. He's pointing her to God. He encourages her to take refuge under God's wings. This is very important. Safe people understand that God is God and they are not. All right? You can't be someone's everything. Only God can be that. You can't be someone's comfort the way that God can. I just say point them to God to be their comfort. Don't try to take the place of God with people. Our Hesed love is meant to point people to God, not take the place of God in people's lives. All right? Now, if you want to have better relationships, you need to entrust yourself to God first, then entrust your heart to safe people. I just want to leave you with some evaluation questions, really simple. They fit with our main point today. Am I entrusting myself to God? Am I entrusting my heart to safe people? And am I a safe person? Because God is calling us to entrust ourselves to Him and to entrust our hearts to safe people. His desire is that we would be a safe person. We would be a church full of safe people, and that we would be safe people in this community and in our families. That's what God's calling us to. The world needs more people like that. So, let's live it out this week. Will you pray with me?